Thank you, Katie and the team, for leading us, and thank you all for singing. Welcome to our online audience. We continue our journey through the Old Testament this morning by exploring the life of Abraham and Sarah's grandson, Jacob, the son of Isaac and Rebekah. Jacob is best known as the father of the 12 sons who became the leaders of Israel's 12 tribes. And I just need to say as we begin today that I'm really looking forward to preaching this message. I love Jacob's story. Some time ago, I was thinking about doing a whole series on Jacob, and today I have to pack that into one sermon. So it might end up being a little long. No, it won't be that long. I'm just kidding you. But Jacob, so Daniel is probably my favorite character in the Old Testament. I love Daniel's life. Others of you here like Daniel. Good. Daniel, that's your name. I get you. I got you. Daniel is probably my favorite character, but I like preaching on Jacob almost for the opposite reason, and that is that as we look at Jacob's life, at times it's hard to find many redeeming qualities, honestly. And so I just want to say on the front end that as I'm enjoying myself preaching about Jacob's flaws and faults, I also identify with Jacob, and I think many of you will as well. Just the way that he lived life and his commitment to doing whatever he could to attain success for himself. And you'll see that time and again God would remind him, Jacob, I'm the one that's working here. All the stuff you're doing isn't really what's pushing you forward. Jacob would say, yeah, you're right. He would recognize that, and then he'd go off and pursue it himself again. And I think that quality is why I think Jacob in many ways embodied the spirit of our age. Pastor Andy Stanley of North Point Church in Atlanta preached a series that he titled Jacob Isaacson. The surname Isaacson comes from the Hebrew practice of creating a last name by adding son to the name of the child's father. And so Jacob's father was Isaac, which made him Jacob Isaacson. Jacob lived nearly 4,000 years ago, but in using the title Jacob Isaacson, Andy Stanley highlighted Jacob's relevance for our age. And so it's really pretty amazing that this guy lived 4 millennia ago, and yet there's so much about him and the way that he lived life that I think many of us identify with. So who was this man Jacob, whom we're introduced to in Genesis chapter 25? I'd like to read verses 19 to 23. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Paddan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Now, before we read more of Jacob's story, I want you to pay attention to that last 6 words, those last 6 words in that passage. The prophetic word at Jacob's birth. The older will serve the younger. And that was proven true throughout Jacob's life. Isaac's wife Rebekah was barren. She was unable to conceive children, but Jacob prayed for her, and God answered the prayer by blessing her with twins. Her pregnancy was difficult, and she asked God, what's going on? Why am I having such a difficult time? And he said, there are 2 nations inside you, and the younger son will rule over the older one. Now, you may be aware of this, but the Hebrew culture of that day gave the firstborn son many advantages over his younger siblings. The firstborn son's birthright included at least twice as much inheritance as any of his brothers, and he was given the blessing of the father prior to the father's death. These benefits were given to the oldest son because he was the one that was responsible to carry on the family line. And being the firstborn son was a big deal. because of the privileges that came with it. And now let's continue reading verses 24 to 34 of Genesis 25. I'm going to actually just read a couple verses here we start, and then I'll read the rest of it. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out, with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. Verse 26 tells us, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named Jacob. Is there anybody here, first of all, this morning named Jacob? You want to raise your hand? Anybody want to identify themselves? It's a good name. I know there are people in the second service, maybe some here who aren't willing to, what I've said so far, said, yeah, I'm going to keep my hand down. It's a good name, and I'm not trying to embarrass you for that. It's a good, solid name. That name literally means he grasped the heel. Now, I don't hear this saying used too much now. I used to hear it a while ago. This phrase, he pulled my leg, or you're pulling my leg. Are you familiar with that? Are younger people here familiar with that too? Okay, some of you who are raising your hand as younger, I was thinking younger than you, but you go with that. Some of the middle-aged people over here are familiar with it. No. So, he pulled my leg. It's a statement that means, are you tricking me or deceiving me? Isaac and Rebekah's youngest son was given the name Jacob because he came out of the womb holding on to his brother's heel. And you're going to see that phrase kind of has a double meaning, grabbing the heel, but also one who deceives or tricks. And that definitely was descriptive of Jacob's life. And we'll see that starting at least here in verse 27. The boys grew up. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That's why he was also called Edom. Jacob replied, "First sell me your birthright." Now I just want to pause there. I mean, if your brother's hungry, comes in from the field, wants some soup, and the first thing you think of is, I want you to trade your birthright to me. Like, this is something he was really fixated on. "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. As the oldest son, Esau was destined to receive many benefits. But early on in their relationship, Jacob began to scheme about how he could receive the blessing usually reserved for the oldest son. And Jacob's trickery wasn't limited to his brother. The incident I read about, Jacob stealing his brother's birthright, is just one example among many of the chicanery that we see throughout Jacob's life. I had to look for creative words so that I wasn't repeating myself to talk about Jacob's trickery. Later I'll call him a scoundrel, and that may seem a little harsh, but when you see this guy's life, it was all about tricking and manipulating and deceiving. That's why I say that Jacob embodied the spirit of our age. He was a pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of guy. He should have had a bumper sticker on his donkey's rump that said, "Just do it." His life motto could have been the saying that some of you may be familiar with, "If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying." Because his whole life, he was cheating and working and manipulating to try to get what he thought was his, or what should be his. Now, before we look more closely at Jacob's pattern of taking things into his own hands to ensure that he got what he thought he deserved, I want to reflect on our series titled Sinners and Saints. The backdrop for this series is that the people that God used in the Bible to accomplish his purposes weren't super saints. They were people with warts just like you and me. And I hope we can all grab this truth, that if God was able throughout the Bible to use people who weren't just super saints, but had flaws and insecurities and shortcomings and sin just like us, then it would also be true that he can use us. That he can use you and he can use me with our shortcomings, our weaknesses, our flaws to accomplish his purposes. Many of the Bible characters that we're looking at this summer were undeniably saints who had some warts. But Jacob, honestly, is presented to us as a sinner on whom God bestowed his grace and used in spite of his flaws. Jacob's life reinforces Tyler Staton's quote that I've highlighted each week in this series. To paraphrase, the Bible doesn't call good people saints. It calls people saints who experienced the goodness of God. And so as we look at Jacob's life, we'll see someone who experienced the goodness of God in spite of what seems to be his repeated attempts to ignore that and kind of go his own way. To give you an idea why Jacob has the reputation of a scoundrel, I'll share some other examples of his scheming and conniving. And you can read about Jacob in detail in Genesis 25 to 35, and I really would encourage you to do that this afternoon. If you're familiar with the story, it'd be good to have a refresher. And if you're not familiar with it, I think you'll learn a lot just reading the story, in case you think I'm making some of this stuff up. Sometime after Jacob and Esau turned 40, their father's health began to decline. And as was the custom in that day, the father would call the youngest son to himself and give him his blessing. And so Isaac said to Esau, the oldest son, "My days here on earth are numbered. I want you to go out and kill some game and prepare it just like I like it. Bring it to me, and I'll pray for the fatherly blessing over you." We read earlier that Jacob's mother, Rebekah, preferred him to Esau, right? So she was with him in a lot of this scheming and manipulating and deceiving. She calls Jacob in and says, "Hey, here's what's happening. Your father's going to give the fatherly blessing to Esau. We can get this for you. Here's what I want you to do. Go kill some of our livestock. That way it won't take so long as going out and hunting a deer. Prepare it. I'll prepare it just the way your father likes it." Jacob at one point says, "Well, my brother's really hairy. And I'm smooth-skinned. How's my father not going to know who it is?" She said, "Well, I've got that covered. We're going to take some hair or fur from an animal." He must have been really hairy. "Put it on your arms and your neck. And I think we can pull this off. Your father's not seeing very well. His mind's probably going a little bit, so I think we can do this." So Jacob goes out, kills some cattle, brings it in. She prepares it. He puts his fur on and smells and everything like his brother, comes into his dad and says, "Here's the meal that I prepared for you. I'm ready for your blessing." Isaac's a little bit skeptical and says, "Well, your voice sounds a little bit like Jacob, and are you sure you're not Jacob? This is really Esau?" Jacob assured him that it was Esau. He ate the food, enjoyed it, and he prayed the fatherly blessing over Jacob. Shortly after this happens, Esau comes in, goes to his father with a meal. "Here's the meal I prepared for you, father." And Isaac realized what just happened. And so does Esau. Esau is ready to kill Jacob. Jacob's mother Rebekah says, "Hey, you better flee because your brother's not happy. You need to get out of here." And so Jacob left and traveled to some relatives in a foreign place. One of the things that becomes evident as we read Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, and Jacob's stories is that deceit and manipulation was a family trait. If you want to see a generational pattern of sin, just look at the early family in the Old Testament, and you'll see this repeated actions of manipulating, deceiving to get what they wanted. And this penchant for deception was alive and well in Jacob's uncle Laban too, because that's the family that he went to. Through trickery, Laban gave his oldest daughter Leah to Jacob as his wife when Jacob thought he was marrying her younger sister. And again, you can't make this stuff up. You got to read it. Jacob thinks he's married Rachel. In the morning, finds out it's actually Leah, because his uncle said, in our culture, it's the custom to marry the oldest daughter off first, so you'd have to marry her. But he didn't bother telling Jacob that. So Jacob said, well, I still want Rachel. And Laban says, okay, you've worked for me 7 years for this daughter, work for me 7 more. So for 14 years, Jacob's slaving for his father-in-law for his 2 daughters. Sometime over the course of that time, here's another piece of deception, Jacob complains that he's not gaining anything in terms of his own, financial livelihood. He's not gaining anything from this arrangement other than the 2 daughters. And so Laban says, okay, I'll give you the spotted and speckled and striped livestock, which thinking that there's probably not very many. And Jacob rounds all those up and has a little flock of his own. And then he does something which the Bible doesn't really explain except that there was some kind of superstition. He took branches and he peeled off the bark and put it in front of the troughs where they mated. And somehow the superstition was that would lead to the animals bearing livestock that had stripes and spots too. And that's what began to happen. Many of the livestock that were then born were striped and spotted, and so Jacob's herd begins to multiply and grow. And Laban is getting more and more upset, and Laban's sons are getting upset because they feel like Jacob is stealing their inheritance. And so they decide it's time to leave. And throughout this, and multiple times throughout Jacob's life, God comes to him and says, Jacob, you know it's not your superstition that is getting you blessed. It's my blessing and favor, right? And Jacob would say, yes, I understand that. And then he would go back to manipulating and deceiving again. I know that some of this is complicated, and again, I'm trying to cover it pretty quickly. I would encourage you to go and read Genesis 25 to 35. Eventually, Jacob and his wives and children, servants and flocks, left Laban, and as he was traveling, he received word that his brother Esau was coming. You remember the one that he tricked out of the birthright and then out of the fatherly blessing. So, not surprisingly, Jacob fears for his life. And he comes up with this complicated plan where he arranges his flocks and all his family into groups, and he starts sending them ahead one by one. And as each group comes to Esau, and Esau says, who are you? They're instructed to say, we're with your brother Jacob, and he wants you to have this as a gift. And so he was basically trying to bribe them. He sends group after group. Not coincidentally, he stays behind at the very end, hoping that by the time he gets there, Esau's anger will be pacified. When Esau met Jacob, he hugged him. He told him that he had forgiven him, and he had enough of his own wealth, and he didn't need Jacob's gifts. And then Jacob lied once again. Esau said, hey, let's meet up here in this city of Seir, and we'll spend time together there. And Jacob says, well, you know, some of my wives have just had kids, and they're young, and some of the livestock are pregnant. We're going to be traveling a lot slower than you. How about you go on ahead, and we'll meet you there later? Jacob never intends to meet him there. He goes off in some other direction because he's still not convinced that Esau isn't going to harm him. And so there's more, but I wanted to give you those examples of Jacob's deception and trickery and manipulation. And hopefully you can understand why I'm not just being hard on the guy. He really was wired to, or what he chose was to manipulate and deceive all of the time. Despite God's prophecy that Jacob would be blessed and that he would rule over his brother, Jacob spent his life working to ensure that he would be successful and come out on top. And at various points along the way, God would remind him, Jacob, my blessing and favor is on you. That's why you're successful. But Jacob would go back to trying to work hard to ensure his own success. Now, I've given a lot of background very quickly about Jacob's life and his determination to be successful by whatever means he could. I want us to look now at what really is the signature moment in Jacob's life, his wrestling match with God. And so I want you to back up. I talked about Jacob preparing to meet Esau, sending out these groups of flocks and herds and servants and his wives and kids, group by group, to meet Esau. He sent them across a river, and he stayed on this side all by himself. And as you can imagine, he was terrified. because the next day he was going to meet the brother that he had just tricked out of his inheritance and his blessing. And I can imagine that Jacob didn't sleep well that night. Let's read verses 32 to 22, chapter 32, verses 22 to 32. And this really is the signature moment in Jacob's life where he encountered God. That night, and again, it's the night before he's going to meet Esau the next day, Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across, he went over after he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it's daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go until you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said to him, "Please tell me your name." He replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Joseph called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. As Jacob slept, no doubt restlessly, because he was filled with fear and uncertainty over the impending meeting with his brother, he encountered a divine being. The text calls him a man and doesn't indicate whether it was an angel or some other being or God himself. Some even speculate that it may have been Jesus. Whoever it was, Jacob understood that the being was divine and represented God. And Jacob wrestled with this man or this being until daybreak, demanding a blessing and the assurance that he would be protected from Esau. The man told Jacob to let him go, but Jacob refused until he received a blessing. And I just want to pause there. So all of his life, Jacob has wrestled and struggled with humans. He's manipulated them and tricked them and deceived them to try to get what he wanted, what he thought he deserved, to try to achieve success. But in this moment, all of that was pulled away. The manipulating, the deceiving, the cheating was over. It was just him and his brother Esau as he spent that night alone. And in that moment, in that night, in a dream, or we're not told exactly what it was, he encountered God. And he wrestled with God, demanding that God bless him. And at the end of that wrestling match, the angel, the divine being, God, whoever it was, said, "You've spent your life wrestling with people. Now you're wrestling with me." And he was rewarded for that. He was blessed. Before he would give Jacob a blessing, though, the man asked, "What is your name?" And Jacob gave him his name. This seemingly simple question and answer was packed with meaning. Before God would bestow a blessing on Jacob, he wanted him to honestly acknowledge who he was. When he answered, "I'm Jacob, I'm the heel grabber, I'm the deceiver, the manipulator, the one who tries to get whatever he can through his own wisdom and strength," when he answered that, he was finally honest about who he was. This was a formative moment for Jacob. And after he honestly acknowledged who he was positioned to receive God's blessing. In response to Jacob sharing his identity, God said this, "Your name will no longer be Jacob," deceiver, manipulator, heel grabber, "but Israel," one who struggles with God, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Finally, in the middle of his distress and his fear, when there was no one left to manipulate or deceive, Jacob wrestled with God. He demanded a blessing from him, and God blessed him. Jacob, or Israel as he was now known, went on to become the patriarch of Israel, the father of the 12 sons, who led the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, having heard the summary of Jacob's life, hopefully you understand my opening comment that Jacob embodied the spirit of our age. I don't think we have to work too hard to draw parallels to our own lives, because I think every one of us at some level is wired to try to get what we think we deserve. And if life or God doesn't give it to us, then we're going to work hard ourselves. I think that's part of who each of us is as human beings. And as I've thought about each of the characters that we've looked at, Noah, and not so much Noah in the story that we're told in the scriptures, but particularly Abraham and Sarah, and Jacob, and others that we'll see, we see this theme of trust and reliance on God in the face of our own natural bent to try to get things for ourselves, to work things out, to do whatever it takes to get what we think we deserve. At its core, the question that Jacob's life compels us to ask is, what's my name? And how does my identity lead me to rely on myself rather than on God? I think that's the question for each of us. Who am I? What's our identity? What do we default to when we try to get what we think is ours as opposed to relying on God? What does that look like for us? Jacob's natural bent was to work hard, to scheme and deceive and to manipulate people and circumstances to try and ensure his own success. Excuse me. That tendency led him to rely on himself rather than turning to God and relying on him. So then the question that comes to mind for me, and I think for each of us, is, what do I rely on to do what I can to be successful? Money, hard work, being a good person who does all the right things that good people are supposed to do, brains, strength, good looks, being a detailed person who leaves no stone unturned or no loose end. Few of the things that came to mind as I thought about an answer to this question. And for many of us, we may identify with several of those. Those are things that we use in our attempt to remove or at least minimize the uncertainties of life. They're things that we find ourselves drawn to pursue rather than relying on God and trusting in Him. And again, as I say that about Jacob, I hope you understand, as I share that with you, I'm not standing up here trying to denounce you all for your tendency to do that. That's part of who I am as well. That's part of who we are as humans. As you think about your life, do you rely on any of those things or other things in place of God as you seek to find meaning and purpose in life and as you strive to be successful? Although God favored Jacob and promised that he would be blessed, Jacob spent much of his life striving for success. Am I able to place our trust in God, believing He loves you and He's looking out for you? Are you secure and at peace knowing your identity rests in being God's son or daughter and not in what you accomplish or in what you achieve? I realize the questions I'm throwing at you are deep questions. I've had the luxury of being able to think about those and wrestle with them all week, and you just kind of get them thrown at you in a half-hour time. They're significant questions about our identity, about who we are and who we are in Christ. Do we primarily see ourselves as Jesus' beloved son or daughter? Or do we see ourselves as somebody who needs to strive for success, to chart our own course? I was reading something this week, and it pointed out again the significance of Jesus' baptism. Before he began his public ministry, Jesus was baptized, and as he came up out of the water, the voice from heaven said, "This is my son whom I love, with him I am well pleased." Even Jesus, God's son, needed to minister from that place of strength where he understood his identity was the Father's beloved. And God was pleased with him. And it was from that place that he went out into the wilderness then to be tempted by the devil, and then went into 3+ years of ministry before going to the cross. That identity as God's son or daughter is critical for each of us, just as it was critical for Jesus. As I thought about how to wrap up this morning, because I think you can tell my struggle to try to get my hands or mind and help us get our minds around these deep questions, I wrote a prayer that I'd like to read for you, and I'd encourage you to get into a posture of prayer. It's going to be on the screen behind me. If you'd like to read it, if that helps you tune in, do that. If you want to just bow your heads and get into a posture of prayer, that's fine. But I'd like you to, if you identify with this prayer, to pray it with me. Not out loud. I'd like you just to pray it in your heart. But I believe that this prayer really captures a lot around Jacob's life that I want to embrace this morning for myself, and my hope is that you would as well. So I pray this prayer. Heavenly Father, my name is, fill in the blank. Just as Jacob admitted his penchant for trying to make his own way rather than wrestling in prayer with you, I acknowledge before you my tendency to rely on myself rather than you. Too often I lean on, fill in the blank, rather than turning to you as my source of strength, wisdom, direction, and security. I confess that to you today, and I ask Jesus that you would truly be the Lord of my life. May I, like Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, submit myself to you and trust you to work out your purposes in my life, rather than acting like I'm the one who controls my own destiny. I claim the words of Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6 for my life. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. Amen. I want to invite the worship team to come up. And if that prayer, the essence of that prayer really resonates with you, I invite you just to take this time as we sing together to recommit yourself to God. If you'd like to pray with somebody and make that, if there's something you're feeling led to really commit to God in prayer and want to pray with somebody, there will be prayer partners along the side who can pray with you. If you want to come to the front and pray by yourself at the prayer bench, feel free to do that. Maybe you want to just turn to somebody next to you and ask them to pray for you. But I invite each of us to respond as God leads. Katie?